The day I walked into that courtroom, cameras flashing, I expected public humiliation. But then the judge asked one question, and in that instant, my father froze, my brother's smirk died, and their lawyer turned paper white, revealing a secret I had guarded for 8 long years. I was sitting in a federal bankruptcy courtroom, packed with strangers, not because I was out of money, but because my own parents wanted the entire city to believe I was destitute. My mother, Vivian, wept dramatically into her silk scarf, while my brother, Bryce, watched with a smug, certain smirk, convinced he was about to witness my public humiliation. Then, the judge, a man named Mallory Keene, paused. He looked up, and he asked a single question that made their high-priced lawyer, Sterling Vance, turn instantly pale. In that moment, after 8 years of carefully constructed silence, I knew. My moment had finally arrived. My name is Sidney Ross, and I'm 36 years old. I was at the defendant's table in federal bankruptcy court, downtown Chicago. My hands were folded on the cool, unforgiving mahogany. The air conditioning hummed a low, industrial drone, a losing battle against the oppressive heat of all the bodies packed into that room. This wasn't your standard, dry bankruptcy hearing. Usually, these things are quiet, administrative affairs, attended only by tired lawyers and the occasional desperate creditor. But today, Courtroom 7 felt less like a hall of justice and more like a coliseum. My parents had made damn sure of that. Across the aisle, the plaintiff's table was crowded. My father, Graham Hawthorne, sat with the rigid posture of a man posing for a statue. His spine ramrod straight, his expression capable of winning an Academy Award for the grieving father betrayed by his wayward child. Beside him sat my mother, Vivian, draped in severe black, a color choice that screamed she was mourning the death of my financial solvency. She held a silk handkerchief to her face, dabbing at eyes that were suspiciously dry, with the rhythmic precision of a metronome. And then there was Bryce, my brother, the golden boy of Lake Forest. Bryce leaned slightly forward, elbows on the table, exuding the easy confidence of a man who'd never been told no without a checkbook eventually appearing to soften the blow. He caught my eye for a fleeting second and offered a small, sad smile. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. To the gallery behind him, which included 3 reporters from local papers and a scattering of Lake Forest socialites who treated gossip like oxygen, that smile said, I tried to save her. I did everything I could. To me, it screamed, I'm going to crush you into dust, little sister. I looked away, focusing instead on the seal of the United States hanging behind the empty judge's bench. The room smelled of floor wax and expensive perfume, a nauseating mix that brought back every memory of Sunday dinners I had spent years trying to forget. You doing okay? The whisper came from my left. Daniela Ruiz, my attorney, didn't look at me. She was too busy arranging 3 heavy banker boxes on the table in front of us, stacking them with a deliberate slowness, the cardboard scraping against the wood. I'm fine, I whispered back, my voice barely audible. Good, Daniela said, smoothing the lapel of her charcoal blazer, because they are putting on quite a show. Look at the press. Your father must have called in every favor his owed since 1995. They want a spectacle, I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in my blood. They don't just want to bankrupt me, Daniela. They want to make sure I can never work in this town again. They want to paint me as the incompetent daughter who played at business and lost her brother's inheritance. Daniela finally looked at me. Her dark eyes were hard, intelligent, and utterly devoid of fear. Let them paint, she said softly. We brought the turpentine. All rise, the bailiff called out, and the room shuffled to its feet as Judge Mallory Keene entered. He was a man in his 60s with a face that looked like it had been carved out of granite and then left out in the Chicago winter for a decade. He did not look happy. The docket was full, and a contested family bankruptcy involving high-profile socialites was likely the last thing he wanted to referee. We sat today. The air in the room grew heavy, a physical weight pressing down on my chest. The lawyer for the Hawthorns, Sterling Vance, a man who charged $600 an hour to destroy lives, stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket with a flourish. Your Honor, Vance began, his voice a rich baritone that carried to the back of the room without a microphone. "We are here today with heavy hearts. This is not a case of malicious prosecution. This is a tragedy of a family trying to recoup a massive loss caused by mismanagement." He gestured toward me as if I were a stain on the carpet. The debtor, Miss Ross, solicited a personal loan from her brother, Mr. Bryce Hawthorne, in the amount of $2.4 million. Vance continued, "This money was explicitly earmarked to save her failing technology startup, a company she calls Northbridge Shield Works. The agreement was clear. The money was an investment to cover payroll and essential server costs to prevent immediate insolvency." A murmur went through the gallery. $2.4 million. To the average person, it was a fortune. To my family, it was a weapon. Vance paced before the bench, weaving a narrative I had heard 1,000 times over the dinner table. Only now, it was being transcribed for the legal record. "Mr. Hawthorne provided these funds out of love, Your Honor. He wanted to support his sister's ambition. But we have evidence, bank statements, emails, witness testimony, that shows the company was already a sinking ship. Ms. Ross took the money, burned through it in less than 6 months on frivolous expenses, and is now claiming inability to pay. We are asking the court to pierce the corporate veil, declare the company's assets, what little there are, forfeit, and grant Mr. Hawthorne immediate relief as the primary creditor." I watched my mother. She let out a soft, audible sob, right on cue. My father patted her hand, looking stoically at the floor. It was a perfect story. The reckless daughter, the benevolent brother, the squandered fortune. "Northbridge Shield Works has no viable product, Your Honor," Vance concluded, leaning on the lectern. "It is a shell, a hobby that got out of hand. And now Mr. Hawthorne simply wants to recover what he can from the wreckage." Vance sat down. The silence that followed was thick with judgment. I could feel the eyes of the reporters baiting into the back of my neck. They were already composing the headlines. "Hawthorne heiress bankrupt startup. Brother left holding the bag." Judge Keene looked over his reading glasses at our table. "Ms. Ruiz, does the defense wish to make an opening statement?" Daniela stood up. She did not pace. She did not use big hand gestures. She stood perfectly still. "We do, Your Honor," she said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room's humidity like a scalpel. The narrative presented by Mr. Vance is compelling. It has drama. It has emotion. It has a very large number attached to it. However, it lacks one critical element. She paused, letting the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds. "Truth." Daniela reached for the first of the 3 boxes. "We can test the validity of the debt. We can test the claim of insolvency. And we can test the characterization of my client's business as a hobby." The plaintiff claims Miss Ross borrowed $2.4 million to save a failing company. "We will demonstrate that no such transfer ever occurred, that the loan documents submitted to this court are fabrications, and that Northbridge Shield Works is not only solvent, but is currently one of the most secure financial entities in the state of Illinois." She patted the top of the box. "We have prepared 3,000 pages of discovery, Your Honor, forensic accounting, server logs, and sworn affidavits that paint a very different picture of why the Hawthorne family is so desperate to force this company into receivership." Bryce laughed. It was a short, sharp sound, quickly stifled, but it was there. He thought we were bluffing. He thought I was still the girl who hid in her room while he charmed the country club. Judge Keene did not look impressed by the laugh. He pulled the case file toward him, opening the thick binder that Vance had submitted. He flipped through the pages, his expression neutral. $2.4 million, the judge muttered, reading, promissory note dated October 14th, 2022. "Yes, Your Honor," Vance said, half rising from his chair, signed and notarized. The judge turned a page, then another. He rubbed his temple. For a moment, it seemed like he was just going through the motions, skimming the paperwork so he could move on to the next case on his docket. I watched his hand. He had a gold wedding band and a watch that looked practical, not flashy. He stopped. His hand froze on a page near the back of the plaintiff's exhibit. It was the section detailing the assets of Northbridge Shield Works that Bryce wanted to seize. The judge's brow furrowed. He tilted his head slightly, as if he were trying to read fine print that didn't make sense. He looked up at the ceiling for a moment, narrowing his eyes, searching his memory. Then he looked back down at the document. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The scratching of the reporter's pen stopped. Even my mother seemed to hold her breath, sensing a disruption in the rhythm of the performance. Judge Keene slowly took off his reading glasses. He folded them and placed them on the bench. He looked at me. It was not the look of a judge looking at a defendant. It was a look of a man trying to solve a puzzle that had just changed shape in front of his eyes. He looked at me, then at the name on the file, then back at me. "Counsel," the judge said. His voice was quiet, but the microphone picked it up and amplified the bass, sending a rumble through the floorboards. "Approach the bench." Daniela moved instantly. Vance hesitated for a split second, glancing at Bryce before buttoning his jacket again and walking to the front. I couldn't hear what was being whispered, but I saw the body language. The judge was leaning over, tapping a finger on the document. He spoke in a low, urgent murmur. Daniela nodded once, her face impassive. "But Vance," I watched the color drain out of Sterling Vance's face. It started at his neck and moved up to his hairline until he looked like a sheet of printer paper. He gripped the edge of the bench, his knuckles turning white. He tried to say something, shaking his head, pointing back at his client, but the judge cut him off with a sharp hand motion. The judge waved them back. "Sit down," Judge Keene ordered. Vance practically stumbled back to his table. He leaned over and whispered something frantically to Bryce. For the first time all morning, the smirk vanished from my brother's face. He looked confused, then annoyed. My father sat up straighter, his betrayed parent mask slipping to reveal the shock underneath. Judge Keene picked up his glasses but did not put them back on. He held them like a gavel. He looked out over the courtroom, his gaze sweeping over the reporters, over my parents, and finally landing squarely on me. "Miss Ross," the judge said. He did not address my lawyer. He addressed me directly. I stood up. My legs felt weak, but I locked my knees. "Yes, Your Honor." I was reading the Financial Times this morning with my coffee, the judge said conversationally, though there was steel underneath the tone. There was a rather extensive article about the vulnerability of the national power grid and the new safeguards being implemented by the Department of Energy. The room was dead silent. I could hear the hum of the vending machine in the hallway outside. The article mentioned a specific contractor, the judge continued, a firm that has apparently just secured a classified contract to overhaul the cybersecurity protocols for 3 major interstate energy substations, a firm that, according to the article, is considered a hidden unicorn in the operational technology security sector. He looked at the file again. The name of that company was Northbridge Shield Works. My mother stopped dabbing her eyes. Her hand froze midair. The judge looked at Vance. "Mr. Vance, your filing states that Northbridge Shield Works is a failed startup with no viable product and zero solvency. You are asking this court to place a company which I am now led to believe is currently managing active national security infrastructure into the hands of a private creditor based on a family dispute." Vance stood up, his voice cracking. "Your Honor, my client believes the media reports are exaggerated. The financial reality, the judge interrupted, his voice rising, is that I am looking at a bankruptcy petition for a company that, if my memory serves me correctly from the article I read 4 hours ago, just signed a government contract worth more than $100 million. A gasp went through the room. It wasn't from the gallery. It was from my father. Graham Hawthorne turned to stare at me, the shock on his face so genuine it hurt to look at. He didn't know. He thought he was crushing a lemonade stand. He didn't know he was trying to bulldoze a bunker. "I have a question," Judge Keene said, leaning forward, "and I want a very careful answer." He pointed a finger at the plaintiff's table. "Why is a company that safeguards federal infrastructure listed in my docket as a hobby?" I looked at Bryce. He was staring at the table, his jaw clenched so hard I could see the muscle jumping in his cheek. He knew. Of course, he knew. That was why he was here. He wasn't trying to collect a debt. He was trying to hijack a clearance. I looked back at the judge. I kept my face completely neutral, masking the fierce, burning satisfaction that was starting to bloom in my chest. "Because, Your Honor," I said, my voice steady and clear, "they did not think you would check. The judge stared at me for a long moment. Then he turned his gaze back to Vance, and the look in his eyes was terrifying. It was the look of a man who realized his court was being used as a weapon, and he did not like being the trigger. In that silence, as the reporters frantically began typing into their phones, and my mother looked around in panic, I knew one thing for certain. The script had been flipped, the curtain had been torn down, and the 8 years I had spent building my fortress in the dark were about to come crashing down on top of them in the light. To understand why my father looked at me with such genuine shock in that courtroom, you have to understand the ecosystem that created Graham Hawthorne. We grew up in Lake Forest, Illinois, a place where wealth doesn't shout, it whispers. And usually, it whispers about who is falling behind. In our world, success wasn't measured by what you built, but by what you maintained. My father ran Hawthorne Crest Advisors, a boutique wealth management firm that handled money for families who had stopped working for a living 3 generations ago. His job was essentially to shake hands, drink single malt scotch, and ensure that the interest rates remained slightly higher than the inflation rates. My brother, Bryce, was a crown prince of this kingdom. From the time he was 5 years old, he was dressed in miniature blazers and taught how to order in French. He was the heir apparent, the golden vessel into which my father poured all his vanity. Bryce didn't have to be smart. He just had to be presentable. My sister, Camille, was the diplomat. She viewed the world through the lens of a gala invitation. To Camille, a global crisis was only relevant if it threatened the date of the Botanical Garden fundraiser. She sat on 5 different charity boards, married a man who worked in futures trading, and treated conversation like a game of tennis where the goal was never to let the ball touch the ground. And then there was me. I was the glitch in the Hawthorne matrix. I did everything I was supposed to do on paper. I went to the right prep schools. I learned which fork to use for the salad. And I even earned an MBA from Northwestern. But while my classmates were vying for internships at Goldman Sachs, I was obsessing over the invisible grid that kept the lights on. I fell in love with operational technology security. To most people, that sounds like dry technical jargon. To me, it was a nervous system of the modern world. I wasn't interested in protecting credit card numbers or email passwords. I wanted to protect the industrial control systems that managed water treatment plants, electrical substations, and hospital oxygen supplies. I saw the terrifying vulnerability in the jagged edge where old, rusting infrastructure met the modern internet, and it terrified me enough to make me want to fix it. I remember the day I tried to explain this to my family. It was a Sunday in late November. The sky outside was the color of a bruised plum. We were in the library, a room smelling of leather and lemon polish. I had prepared a pitch deck. I had market analysis. I had a roadmap for a startup that focused on securing legacy industrial hardware. I laid it all out on the mahogany coffee table. I spoke for 20 minutes about the rising threat of state-sponsored cyber attacks on domestic infrastructure. I talked about the gap in the market. I was passionate, precise, and completely blind to the temperature in the room. When I finished, silence hung heavy in the air. My mother adjusted the pearls at her throat, looking at me with a mixture of pity and confusion, as if I had just announced I wanted to become a professional clown. My father took a sip of his drink and set the glass down with a soft clink. He didn't look at my charts. He looked at me. "This is a hobby, Sydney," he said, his voice smooth and dismissive. I felt a flush rise up my neck. "It is not a hobby, Dad. This is a critical industry sector. The demand is projected to grow by 400% in the next 5 years." He waved his hand, swatting away my statistics like a gnat. "It's toys for those kids who wear hoodies and live in basements. It is not a career for a Hawthorne. We manage capital. We do not crawl around in server rooms fixing wires." Bryce, who was lounging in a wingback chair, chuckled. He picked up one of my printouts, glanced at it, and tossed it back onto the table. "It sounds a bit like being a glorified mechanic, doesn't it, Sid?" I looked at them. I looked at the 3 of them sitting there, safe in their bubble of inherited relevance, completely unaware of how fragile their world actually was. "I am asking for seed capital," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I am asking for an investment. I will pay it back with interest. Treat it like a business transaction." My father sighed. The long, weary sigh of a man burdened by an unreasonable child. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Sydney, look at me. You are smart, but you are confused. You do not have the temperament for business. You are too emotional. You get too attached to the details. If I give you this money, you will bane through it in 6 months trying to save the world. And then you will be back here, broke and embarrassed." He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the manicured lawn. "I will not fund your failure," he said without turning around. "When you are ready to be serious, come talk to me. I'm sure Bryce can find a spot for you in compliance. You can organize the files." That moment was the catalyst. It was not a shouting match. It was a trial. My family had turned the library into a courtroom long before we ever stepped foot in front of Judge Keene. My father was the judge, my mother was the jury, and Bryce was the executioner. I was a defendant, guilty of the crime of wanting something they did not understand. I packed up my papers. I didn't slam the door. I walked out of that house with a cold, hard knot in my stomach that would not dissolve for a decade. The next 3 years were my real education. I moved into a studio apartment in a neighborhood my mother wouldn't drive through with the windows down. I stopped going to the country club. I stopped buying clothes that required dry cleaning. I got a job as a junior analyst at a mid-level IT firm, and I worked nights, learning everything I could about industrial protocols. I learned that the real world doesn't care about your last name. I learned that when a server crashes at 3 o'clock in the morning, nobody cares if you went to Northwestern. They only care if you can get the system back online before the client loses $50,000 an hour. I did grunt work. I pulled cables through crawl spaces filled with rat droppings. I sat in freezing cold data centers, staring at lines of code until my eyes burned. I sold security packages to small manufacturing plants where the owners looked at me like I was trying to sell them magic beans. I learned to sell. I learned to take rejection. I learned that 90% of business is just showing up and doing what you said you would do. But the hardest lesson came from my first partner. His name was Greg. We met at a hackathon, and he seemed to share my vision. He was brilliant, charming, and seemingly dedicated. We worked together for 8 months, building a prototype for a network intrusion detection system. I trusted him. I shared my code, my contacts, and my strategy. One morning, I woke up to find our shared server empty. Greg was gone. He had taken the source code, rebranded it, and sold it to a competitor for $60,000. He blocked my number. He vanished. I sat on the floor of my apartment, staring at the blank screen. I had $80 in my bank account. I had just lost a year of work. It was a crushing blow, but in a strange way, it was liberating. Greg had robbed me, yes, but he hadn't lied to me about who he was. He was a thief. He acted like a thief. The betrayal was transactional. It was different from what my family did. My family smiled at me while they eroded my confidence. They invited me to dinner to remind me of my place. They used affection as a leash. Greg taught me that the world is cruel, but it is an honest cruelty. It will strike you if you're not watching, but it doesn't pretend to love you while it holds the knife. After the incident with Greg, I made a decision. I didn't go back to Lake Forest crying. I didn't ask Bryce for that job in compliance. I simply stopped engaging. I stopped answering the calls on Sunday mornings. I stopped showing up for Easter brunch. I stopped sending updates about my life. It wasn't a dramatic explosion. I didn't send a letter of resignation from the family. I just faded out. My mother would call and leave voicemails, her voice tight with passive-aggressive worry. "Sydney, we're just concerned. We heard you're living in the city. Is everything all right? Do you need money?" I never took the money. Taking their money meant accepting their narrative. If I took a single dollar, I became the charity case they always said I would be. I ate instant noodles. I walked 3 miles to save bus fare. I rebuilt my code from scratch, line by painful line. Every time I felt like quitting, every time the fatigue threatened to pull me under, I would hear my father's voice in that library. "You will fail and come back." That sentence was better fuel than any venture capital check. I used it to burn the midnight oil. I used it to push through the humiliation of cold calling. I used it to build a shell around myself that was harder than diamond. My family thought I was lost. They told their friends at the club, that Sydney was finding herself, a polite euphemism for being a disappointment. They had no idea that I wasn't lost at all. I was building. I was just doing it in the dark where they couldn't see me, and more importantly, where they couldn't stop me. By the way, if you're still with me, make sure to hit subscribe. More unbelievable stories like this are coming. By the time I founded Northbridge Shieldworks, I was a different person. The soft, eager-to-please girl who presented charts in the library was dead. In her place was a woman who knew the value of a contract, the weight of a promise, and the absolute necessity of keeping your enemies guessing. I assumed that if I stayed away, if I kept my head down and built my own life, they would eventually forget about me. I thought I could exist in a parallel universe, separate from the toxicity of the Hawthorne legacy. I was wrong. You can leave a family like mine, but they never really let you go. Not when they smell blood, and certainly not when they smell money. I just didn't realize that my success would be the scent that eventually drew the wolves to my door. Northbridge Shieldworks didn't begin in a gleaming glass tower with a view of Lake Michigan. It began with $12,000, which was the absolute sum total of my life savings, and a refurbished laptop that sounded like a jet engine whenever I opened more than 3 spreadsheets. I rented a space in a converted warehouse district on the far west side of Chicago. This wasn't the trendy part of town with artisan coffee shops and exposed brick lofts. This was the part of town where the streetlights flickered and the wind smelled of diesel and wet concrete. The office was 600 square feet of drafty open space with a concrete floor that seemed to hold a permanent chill. To my family, it would have looked like a squatter's den. To me, it looked like freedom. I wasn't building an app to share photos or a platform to sell artisanal soap. I was building a shield for the things people took for granted until they stopped working. I focused on operational technology, or OT. These are the systems that control the physical world. The valves in a water treatment plant, the breakers in an electrical substation, the HVAC systems in a hospital isolation ward. People worry about their credit card numbers being stolen. I worried about a hacker turning off the cooling system in a nuclear reactor or overloading the pressure in a natural gas pipeline. The industry was terrifyingly vulnerable. Most of these systems were running on software from the 90s, connected to the modern internet with a digital equivalent of duct tape and prayer. My first team consisted of 5 people. We were a collection of misfits who didn't fit the corporate mold. There was Marcus, a network engineer who had been fired from a bank for hacking their security to prove a point. There was Sarah, a code prodigy who dropped out of MIT because she was bored. We didn't have a human resources department or a catered lunch. We had folding tables bought from a liquidation sale and a coffee machine that we treated with religious reverence. We did everything ourselves. When we bought our first rack of servers, we didn't hire movers. We rented a van, backed it up to the loading dock, and carried the hardware up 2 flights of stairs ourselves. I remember sweating through my shirt, my muscles screaming, terrified that I would drop a $10,000 piece of equipment that I had bought on credit. I looked at Marcus, who was grunting under the weight of the other end, and we just started laughing. It was the laughter of the desperate, the sound of people who have burned their bridges and have no choice but to move forward. Our product was simple in concept but a nightmare to execute. We built an intrusion detection system specifically for industrial protocols. It had to be invisible. In a corporate network, if an antivirus scan slows down your email for 5 seconds, it's annoying. In an industrial network, if a scan slows down a robotic arm for 5 milliseconds, it can cause a catastrophic failure. Our software had to sit silently on the wire, watching for anomalies without ever touching the operations. We called it the Ghost Protocol. The first year was a blur of 80-hour weeks and constant anxiety. We ate cold pizza at 3 o'clock in the morning while staring at lines of code that refused to compile. We pitched to plant managers who looked at us with skepticism, wondering why a young woman was lecturing them about SCADA security. But we were good. We were very good. Our first real break came from a mid-sized utility company in Ohio. They had suffered a ransomware attack that nearly shut down their water pumps. They were desperate, and the big security firms were quoting them 6 months for deployment. We told them we could do it in 2 weeks. We did it in 10 days. When the check for that contract cleared, I stayed at the bank balance on my screen for 20 minutes. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to make payroll for 3 months. It was the first time I allowed myself to breathe. As Northbridge started to gain traction, I made a calculated decision that would later become a critical piece of the puzzle. I knew my family. I knew that if the name Sydney Hawthorne started appearing in tech journals, my father would hear about it. He would investigate, and if he saw I was succeeding, he would find a way to intervene. So, I erased myself. I legally remained Sydney Ross, keeping the last name of a brief early marriage that my parents had annulled in spirit if not in law. But for the public-facing side of the company, for the press releases and the industry panels, I used a professional alias. I became Paige Sterling. Paige was my middle name. Sterling was the name of the street where I rented my first apartment. It worked. When Crane Chicago Business ran a feature on Chicago's rising cyber defenders, they interviewed Paige Sterling. They published a photo of me, but I was wearing thick-rimmed glasses and looking away from the camera, focused on a monitor. I cut that article out of the magazine with a pair of scissors. I wanted to frame it. I wanted to send it to my father and say, look at what the hoodie-wearing hobbyist did. Instead, I put the clipping in a manila envelope and locked it in the bottom drawer of my desk. I never told a soul. Not even my team knew the full extent of why I was so paranoid about privacy. They just thought I was eccentric. We grew. We moved out of the warehouse and into a real office park. I hired more engineers. I hired a sales team. But I never let go of that feeling of impending doom. I lived like a person waiting to be discovered. I drove a 5-year-old sedan. I rented a modest condo. I poured every single dollar of profit back into the company. Then came the contract that changed everything. It was a request for proposal from a consortium of federal contractors working for the Department of Energy. They were looking for a unified security architecture for a chain of critical energy substations across the Midwest. This was not just a job. This was a cornerstone of national security. The value of the contract was over $100 million, spread out over 5 years. We were the underdogs. We were up against defense giants with lobbyists and legacy pedigrees. But we had something they didn't. We had a system that was lighter, faster, and already proven in the field to catch the kind of state-sponsored malware the government was terrified of. The vetting process was grueling. They turned my life upside down. They audited our code. They interviewed my elementary school teachers. They combed through my financials with a fine-toothed comb. I was terrified that they would find the Hawthorne connection and think I was a security risk because of my father's international dealings. But they didn't care about my family. They cared about my competence. When we won the bid, I didn't pop champagne. I went into my office, closed the door, and sat on the floor with my back against the wall. I shook. I physically shook from the adrenaline dump. We had done it. We had secured the future of the company. But with the contract came a new level of scrutiny. The government has clauses for everything. One of the most specific clauses involves the financial stability of the contractor. If a contractor files for bankruptcy or is forced into involuntary bankruptcy, it triggers an automatic review. It can lead to an immediate suspension of the contract. The logic is sound. If you cannot manage your own money, you cannot be trusted to manage the nation's secrets. I knew this. It was written in bold text on page 42 of the agreement. I thought I was safe. Northbridge was profitable. We had millions in cash reserves. We had zero debt. I had built a fortress that could withstand any cyber attack. I just hadn't built a fortress that could withstand a family dinner. I still don't know exactly how it happened. Maybe a distant cousin saw a photo of Paige Sterling and recognized the chin. Maybe my father's fame was looking at the same energy sector for investment and stumbled upon our filings. Or maybe, as I later suspected, I had simply let my guard down. I had hired a compliance consultant to help with the government paperwork. She was a nice woman, efficient, chatty. I found out too late that her husband played golf with my brother. It must have been a casual comment, a mention of the massive contract won by a local firm run by a woman who looked vaguely familiar. However it happened, the information traveled from the golf course to the Hawthorne dinner table. They didn't see the hard work. They didn't see the sleepless nights or the servers carried up the stairs. They saw $100 million. They saw a pie that they hadn't been offered a slice of. And in the twisted logic of the Hawthorne family, my success was a theft of their potential. I was sitting in my office late one Tuesday evening, reviewing the deployment schedule for the first substation, when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from my personal bank app, a small alert, then another, then an email from a process server. I felt a cold shiver go down my spine, the kind of primal instinct that tells a gazelle the lion is in the tall grass. I opened the attachment. It was a petition for involuntary bankruptcy filed by Bryce Hawthorne. I stared at the screen, the white light burning my eyes. They had found the one loose thread in the tapestry. They knew about the government contract. They knew that a bankruptcy hearing, even a false one, would freeze my clearance. They knew that to save the contract, I might be forced to settle, to pay them off, to give them equity. I lowered the phone. The silence in the office, usually my sanctuary, suddenly felt like the silence of a tomb. I had spent 8 years running, hiding, and building, thinking I had escaped the gravity of my family's greed. But as I looked at the legal seal on the digital document, I realized I hadn't escaped anything. I had just fattened myself up for the slaughter. I picked up the phone and dialed Daniela Ruiz. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The time for emotion had passed. "Daniela," I said when she answered, "they found me, and they are coming for the company." That night, I didn't go home. I stayed in the office, watching the lights of the city grid I was sworn to protect, knowing that the real threat wasn't a hacker in a basement in a foreign country. It was my own flesh and blood, armed with a lawyer and a lie. The envelope that arrived at my desk was thick, heavy, and stamped with the seal of the United States Bankruptcy Court. When I tore it open, the contents didn't just hurt. They burned. It felt less like a legal notification and more like a vial of acid thrown directly into my face. I sat there, my hand trembling slightly, reading the words that my brother had paid a lawyer to write. In re. Sidney Ross, debtor, petition for involuntary bankruptcy. The filing was a masterclass in fiction. Bryce claimed that he had loaned me $2.4 million 18 months ago. He claimed that Northbridge Shield Works was hemorrhaging cash, that we had missed critical vendor payments, and that without the court's immediate intervention to protect the creditors, the company would collapse within 30 days. But the text wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the attachment. It was a photocopy of a document titled Strategic Investment Agreement. It looked official. It had the right font. It had a date stamped at the top, and at the bottom, right next to Bryce's flamboyant scroll, was my signature. I ran my finger over the photocopied ink. It was my name. It was the way I looped the S and the sharp cross of the T, but it was wrong. The pressure was too even. It lacked the slight jagged edge my hand has had ever since I broke my wrist in college. It was a trace, a high-quality forgery likely lifted from an old birthday card or a thank you note I had sent years ago, then digitally grafted onto this contract. I flipped to page 4, clause 12b, and my blood ran cold. In the event of financial instability or missed quarterly targets, the lender, Bryce Hawthorne, reserves the right to assume temporary operational control and appoint an interim board to safeguard the investment. They didn't just want to embarrass me. They wanted the keys. I grabbed my coat and the file, driving straight to Daniela's office. I didn't even call ahead. When I threw the file onto her glass desk, the sound was like a gunshot. "They forged it," I said, my voice tight. "That is not my signature, and that money never existed. Check my bank accounts. Check the company ledgers. $2.4 million never entered Northbridge. It's a ghost loan." Daniela put on her glasses and began to read. She read slowly, her expression darkening with every page. She didn't gasp. She didn't look shocked. She looked like a surgeon discovering a tumor that was larger than expected. After 10 minutes, she closed the folder and took off her glasses. "They know," she said. "Know what? That I have money." "No," Daniela said, leaning forward. "They know about the federal timeline. Look at the filing date. They filed this yesterday. Do you know what happens next week?" I nodded slowly. The Department of Energy starts the 90-day vetting review for the classified phase. It's the final step before full implementation. "Exactly," Daniela said. "If you are in active bankruptcy proceedings during a vetting review, the government protocol is automatic. They pause the contract. They freeze the clearance. They don't care if the accusations are true or false. They care about risk. A bankrupt contractor is a security risk. She tapped the clause about operational control. They don't just want to make you look bad, Sydney. They want to lock your hands right when the federal government is watching. They want to force a crisis. If the contract is paused, Northbridge stops getting paid. If you stop getting paid, you might actually run into cash flow problems. And then who is standing there with a generous offer to buy you out and save the family name? Bryce, I whispered. Bryce, she confirmed. They want to break your legs and then charge you for the crutches. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the Chicago skyline. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. They were willing to sabotage a national security project just to bring me back under their thumb. It was so incredibly selfish, so perfectly Hawthorne. How did they find out? I asked, turning back to her. I know they heard rumors, but this filing, it references specific liquidity ratios. It references a pending government receivable. How did they get that close? I thought back to the last few months. I had been paranoid. I had been careful. Then I remembered the dinner. Not a family dinner, but a business dinner I had attended 3 months ago with a compliance consultant named Linda. She was an older woman, a friend of a friend, someone I had brought in to help double-check our HR policies for the federal bid. She wasn't a bad person, or so I thought, but she was a social climber. She loved to talk about who she knew. I remembered her mentioning over a glass of wine that she had run into my mother at a charity auction. Your mother is such a lovely woman, she had said. We had a nice chat about how well you were doing. I had frozen then, but Linda had waved it off. Oh, I didn't give details. Honey, just told her you were landing big fish. It was Linda, I said, feeling a wave of nausea. The compliance consultant. She must have fed them the lead. Daniela nodded. It fits. A chatty consultant looking to curry favor with the wealthy Hawthorns. She probably dropped enough hints for them to realize you were sitting on a gold mine. But as I looked at the fake contract again, something nagged at me. Something about page 7. Wait, I said. I pulled the document back toward me. I read the paragraph under collateral description, including the intellectual property rights to the Ghost Protocol intrusion detection system scheduled for Phase 2 deployment at the substations in Gary, Indiana, on November 14th. The room went silent. What is it? Daniela asked. My hands went cold. Linda didn't know about Gary, Indiana, I said, and she definitely didn't know the date, November 14th. Are you sure? I'm positive, I said. The Gary deployment site was classified until 3 days ago. We only unencrypted that file internally on Monday. And the date, November 14th, is a soft target. It's not in the official contract yet. It's only on our internal Gantt chart. I looked at Daniela, and the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Linda gave them the general idea, I said, my voice trembling with rage. But she couldn't have given them this date. She doesn't have access to the project management server. Then who does? Daniela asked. My team, I said. My engineers, my project managers. One of them. You have a rat. Daniela said flatly. I sank into the chair. A rat? Someone inside Northbridge. Someone I had hired. Someone I had shared coffee with. Someone who had helped me carry servers up the stairs. Someone was feeding my brother specific, real-time details about our operations. It made sense. That was how the forgery was so effective. They mixed a big lie, the loan, with small, verifiable truths, the deployment date. It gave the fabrication a scent of legitimacy. If the judge asked, Bryce could say, look, I know about the Gary deployment. How would I know that if I wasn't an investor? We have to fire everyone, I said, panic rising in my throat. I have to purge the team. If I don't, they will leak the defense strategy. No, Daniela said sharply. You do absolutely nothing. What? They are selling me out. If you start firing people now, you spook the rat, Daniela said, her eyes narrowing. And right now, that rat is our only connection to Bryce's strategy. We know they are talking. That means we can control what they hear. She pulled a fresh legal pad toward her. We are going to fight this on 2 fronts, Sydney. In the courtroom, We will attack the forgery. I will get forensic handwriting experts. We will subpoena your brother's bank records to prove the money never left his account. That is the shield. And the sword? I asked. The sword is the leak, she said. We need to prove to the judge that this isn't just a family dispute, but a coordinated corporate espionage campaign. We need to catch your brother using insider information that he shouldn't have. How? You said November 14th was a soft target date, Daniela said. Change it. I looked at her, understanding dawning on me. We set a trap. Exactly. This is what we are going to do. You are going to go back to your office. You are going to act stressed. You are going to act like you are crumbling under the pressure. And then you are going to issue a new, highly confidential internal memo to your management team. What does the memo say? It says that due to the bankruptcy filing, the Gary deployment is being scrapped, Daniela said, a small, dangerous smile playing on her lips. And that you are secretly moving the assets to a new storage facility in, let's say, Milwaukee, on a specific date. Let's make it next Friday. There's no facility in Milwaukee, I said. I know, Daniela replied. But Bryce doesn't. If that Milwaukee location shows up in his next legal filing, if he tries to file an emergency injunction to stop you from hiding assets in Milwaukee, we will have him. We will prove he is getting fed lies in real time. I sat back. It was risky. It required me to walk back into my office and look into the faces of people I trusted, knowing that one of them was holding a knife behind their back. It required me to play the victim when all I wanted to do was scream. But I thought about my father's face when he told me I would fail. I thought about Bryce's smirk and the fake contract. They thought they were playing chess against a child. They didn't realize that for the last 8 years, I had been learning to hunt predators. Okay, I said, standing up. I will write the memo tonight. I will make it look official. Emergency asset relocation plan. Good, Daniela said. And Sydney, don't tell anyone. Not your assistant, not your co-founder. If you want to know who sold you for a check, you have to treat everyone as an enemy until we catch the one who takes the bait. I walked out of her office and into the cool Chicago air. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't from fear anymore. It was from focus. I drove back to Northbridge. The office was humming with activity. My team was there. Marcus, Sarah, the new project managers. They looked up when I entered, their faces full of concern. They had seen the news. They knew something was wrong. Is everything okay, boss? Marcus asked, swiveling in his chair. I looked at him. I looked at Sarah. I looked at the new guy, Jason, who managed the timelines. One of them was texting my brother. One of them was betraying everything we built. I forced myself to look ragged. I let my shoulders slump. I rubbed my eyes. It's bad, guys, I lied, my voice cracking just enough to be convincing. My family, they are trying to freeze everything. We might have to move the hardware to keep it safe. I saw them exchange looks, concern, or calculation. I'm going to send out a plan later tonight, I said. It stays in this room. If this gets out, we are dead. I walked into my office and closed the door. I sat down at my computer and opened a blank document. I typed the header, Confidential Asset Relocation Strategy, Milwaukee. I wasn't just writing a memo. I was loading a weapon, and I was going to wait for my brother to pull the trigger on himself. The week leading up to the hearing was a blur of caffeine, paper cuts, and a cold, simmering rage that I used to fuel 18-hour workdays. Daniela Ruiz turned her conference room into a war room. The long glass table, usually reserved for impressing corporate clients, was buried under 3 feet of documentation. It looked less like a legal defense and more like the architectural blueprints for a demolition. We were building what Daniela called a legal bomb. The goal was not just to deflect the blow. It was to plant an explosive device right under the foundation of their case and detonate it the moment they stepped into court. Daniela had assembled a team of forensic accountants and independent auditors who worked in shifts. They combed through 5 years of Northbridge financial history. Every server purchase, every coffee run, every consulting fee was accounted for. We had tax returns that matched our bank statements down to the penny. We had sworn affidavits from our actual investors, 2 quiet angel investors from Silicon Valley, who were horrified by Bryce's claims, confirming that no Hawthorne money had ever touched the company's accounts. "This is the shield," Daniela said, slapping a thick binder labeled Audit 2023. "This proves you are solvent. But to win, we need to prove they are liars." I was sitting in a corner with my laptop, digging through the digital graveyard of my relationship with my brother. Daniela needed context. She needed proof of the hostility that existed before the bankruptcy filing. "I found it," I said. I spun the laptop around. On the screen was an email chain from October of 2022. That was the specific month Bryce claimed he had wired me the $2.4 million to save my failing company in his legal filing. He described himself during that month as a concerned brother desperate to help. But the email I found told a different story. Subject: Thanksgiving from Bryce Hawthorne. Date: October 12, 2022. Sydney. Mom says you are skipping the holiday again to work on your little science project. Honestly, it's embarrassing. You are playing CEO in a warehouse while the rest of us are actually building the family legacy. Do yourself a favor. Shut down the toy company before you starve. I'm not going to bail you out when the rent comes due. He wrote this 2 days before the date on the alleged promissory note, I said, pointing at the screen. He explicitly says, I'm not going to bail you out. And he calls the company a toy. Daniela smiled, a sharp, predatory expression. Perfect. It goes into Exhibit B. It destroys his narrative of the benevolent investor. Why would a man invest millions in a company he was actively mocking 48 hours prior? But the smoking gun wasn't in the emails. It was in the numbers. Daniela's forensic expert, a man named Mr. Henderson, who wore suspenders and spoke in a whisper, called us over to the main table. He had the forged strategic investment agreement under a magnifying lamp. I have analyzed the wire transfer details listed in Appendix A, Henderson said. The plaintiff listed a source account number and a routing number for the transfer of funds. And I asked, the account number follows the structure of a Hawthorne Crest internal ledger, not a commercial bank account, Henderson explained. But the routing number, it is invalid. It's 9 digits, but the checksum is wrong. It does not belong to any bank in the Federal Reserve System. It is a random string of numbers. If you tried to wire $5 using this number, the system would reject it instantly. Yet, they claimed they successfully wired over $2 million. They got lazy, Daniela said, making a note on her pad. They forged the document, but didn't bother to look up a real routing number. They just typed digits. There's something else, Henderson said, his voice dropping even lower. The notarization. I leaned in. I had seen the stamp on the copy I received, but I had been so focused on the text, I hadn't looked closely at the seal. The signature of the debtor, Ms. Ross, is a forgery, Henderson said. But the notary seal is authentic. It is an embosser pressed into the paper. It is not a digital copy. He moved the magnifying lamp. The raised bumps of the seal cast long shadows on the paper. I read the name on the outer ring of the circle, Vivian E. Hawthorne, Notary Public, State of Illinois. The air left my lungs. My mother, I whispered. Does your mother have a valid commission? Daniela asked sharply. She used to, I said, my mind racing back to my childhood. She was a paralegal for my father's firm in the 90s. She kept her license active to notarize trust documents for clients. But she hasn't worked in 20 years. She stamped this, Henderson said. The impression is physical. That means she had the paper in her hand. She pressed the handle. I stood up and walked away from the table, feeling like I was going to be sick. Up until this moment, I had told myself a comforting lie. I had told myself that Bryce was the villain and my parents were just as enablers, that they were blinded by love for their son and just went along with whatever he said. I thought my father was arrogant and my mother was weak. But this was active participation. My mother had sat at a table, taken a document she knew was a lie, and used her state-issued seal to give it legal weight. She wasn't just watching the play. She was building the set. She was willing to commit a felony, notary fraud, to help Bryce destroy me. This changes the dynamic, Daniela said quietly from behind me. If we prove the seal was used fraudulently, your mother isn't just a witness. She is a co-conspirator. We can compel her testimony. And if she lies on the stand about a document she stamped, she's looking at perjury. Do it, I said. I turned around. The sadness was gone. It had been replaced by a cold, hard clarity. If she wanted to be part of the legal process, let's treat her like a legal party. Subpoena her. Daniela nodded. Done. She then pulled a file from her briefcase. Now we have to talk about the other threat, the dirty play. What else can they do? I asked. They've already sued me. They can try to kill your reputation before we even get to court, Daniela warned. It's a common tactic in hostile takeovers. They might try to impersonate a court official or trustee. They might send letters to your clients saying that Northbridge is under financial restructuring and that all payments should be redirected or accounts frozen. My stomach tightened. The federal contract. Exactly, she said. If the Department of Energy receive an official-looking letter from a bankruptcy trustee claiming that your security clearance is under review, they won't call you to ask if it's true. They will just pull the plug. Bureaucracy is allergic to risk. I knew she was right. I grabbed my phone. I need to get ahead of this, I said. I need to call the contracting officer now. Good, Daniela said. Be professional. Be calm. Tell them it's a malicious litigation and that you are handling it. I stepped into the hallway to make the call. My hands were shaking, but my voice was steady. I spoke to the deputy director of the Oversight Committee. I told him that a disgruntled family member had filed a frivolous claim and that we were moving to dismiss it with prejudice. I gave him Daniela's contact information and the case number. We are fully operational, sir, I said. This is a personal attack, not a financial reality. I wanted you to hear it from me first. The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds. Thank you for the heads up, Miss Ross, the director said. We will flag any incoming correspondence regarding your status for verification. Keep your house in order. I will, I said. I hung up. Defense was set. Now it was time for the offense. I walked back into the room. The feds are notified. Now, let's catch the rat. It was time to execute the trap we had discussed. The next morning, I called an emergency meeting of my senior leadership team. There were 6 of them. Marcus, my lead engineer, Sarah, the architect, Jason, the project manager, and 3 others who handled operations and compliance. We gathered in the glass-walled conference room at Northbridge. I looked at their faces. I had hired these people. I had shared beers with them. I had given them bonuses when we hit milestones, and I knew with sickening certainty that one of them was reporting to Bryce. I threw a folder onto the table. I made sure my hands trembled slightly. I let dark circles show under my eyes. We have a problem, I said, my voice low and stressed. The bankruptcy filing is getting complicated. My lawyers think. They think the court might try to freeze our assets here in Chicago. What does that mean for the deployment? Jason asked. He was a sharp guy, ambitious, always asking about timelines. It means we can't keep the hardware here, I lied. If they lock the doors, we lose the servers for the Gary project. We can't let that happen. I opened the folder. Inside was the fake plan I had typed up the night before. I'm initiating an emergency protocol, I said, looking at each of them in the eye. Tonight at midnight, we are moving the primary server racks and the source code backups to a secure off-site facility. Where? Marcus asked. Milwaukee, I said. I have rented a private storage vault in the 3rd ward. It's off the books. It's cash only. The court doesn't know about it, and my family doesn't know about it. I slid the paper across the table. It had a fake address in Milwaukee and a detailed inventory list. This leaves the building tonight, I said. Do not put this in email. Do not put this on Slack. Verbal orders only. If anyone asks, the servers are down for maintenance. I watched them. Sarah looked anxious. Marcus looked annoyed at the extra work. Jason looked down at the paper. He studied the address. He didn't write it down, but I saw his eyes track the lines, memorizing it. Is that legal? Jason asked, looking up. Moving assets during a bankruptcy. It's survival, I said. Are you with me or not? We are with you, Sarah said. Good, I said. Dismissed. They filed out. I stayed in the room, watching through the glass. 10 minutes later, I saw Jason walk out to the parking lot. He held his phone to his ear. He paced back and forth near his car, talking animatedly. I didn't need to hear the conversation. I knew who he was calling. 2 days passed. The silence from the Hawthorne camp was deafening. Then, on the morning before the hearing, Daniela called me. "Check your email," she said. "Vance just filed an emergency motion." I opened the document. My heart hammered against my ribs. Motion for temporary restraining order and emergency seizure of assets. Plaintiff Bryce Hawthorne has received credible intelligence that the debtor is attempting to conceal assets to defraud creditors. Specifically, the debtor is conspiring to transport critical hardware and intellectual property to an undisclosed location in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to avoid the jurisdiction of this court. I let out a breath I didn't know I was holding. "They took the bait," I said to the empty room. "They swallowed it whole," Daniela said. "He put Milwaukee in a sworn affidavit. He just proved that he has an authorized access to your internal and fake company communications." "We have him," I said. "We have him," she agreed. "Bring that motion to court tomorrow. It is the nail in the coffin." I closed the laptop. The sun was setting over the Chicago skyline, turning the buildings into silhouettes of gold and steel. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into that courtroom and face the people who had raised me. I thought about my mother's notary seal. I thought about Jason's betrayal in the parking lot. I thought about the routing number that led nowhere. They had spent my entire life telling me I wasn't enough. They had hired lawyers to strip me of my name and my work. They wanted a show. They wanted a public execution of my dignity. I stood up and smoothed my blazer. "Okay," I said aloud to the empty office. "You want a show? I will give you a show." The morning of the hearing, the sky over Chicago was a flat, oppressive gray. The kind of weather that felt less like a meteorological event and more like a mood setting for a funeral. I stepped out of the taxi a block away from the federal courthouse, needing a moment of air before entering the arena. I was wearing a navy blue suit, armor I had bought specifically for this day, and carrying a single slim briefcase. Daniela met me at the corner. She looked impeccable, her expression dialed to a frequency of professional lethality. But as we turned the corner toward the courthouse steps, she stopped and grabbed my elbow. "Don't look left," she warned, her voice low. "And keep walking." I looked left. I couldn't help it. There was a van parked near the entrance with a satellite dish on the roof. Standing on the concrete steps were 3 camera crews and a gaggle of reporters holding microphones with channel logos I recognized. "Why are they here?" I asked, my stomach tightening. Bankruptcy hearings are boring. This is administrative. Not when the defendant is a Hawthorne, Daniela said, steering me forward. Someone tipped them off. The narrative is already out there. Sydney Tech heiress squanders family fortune in fake startup. It's clickbait gold. They want a shot of you looking devastated. As we ascended the stairs, the flashbulb started popping. It was disorienting, a strobe light effect in the dull morning light. A reporter from a local tabloid thrust a microphone toward my face. "Miss Ross, is it true you defrauded your brother of $2.4 million? Miss Ross, do you have a comment on the allegations that Northbridge is a shell company?" I kept my eyes forward, fixing my gaze on the revolving brass doors. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab the microphone and tell them that I built my company with sweat and sleepless nights while my brother was buying sports cars. But I knew that was exactly what they wanted. An angry woman is an unstable woman. A silent woman is a mystery. We pushed through the doors into the lobby, the noise of the street cutting off instantly as the heavy glass sealed behind us. But the scene inside was arguably worse. The lobby of the federal courthouse is usually a place of quiet transit, filled with lawyers checking watches and defendants looking at their shoes. Today, it looked like a cocktail hour at the Lake Forest Country Club. My father, Graham Hawthorne, was standing near the security checkpoint. He wasn't looking at his phone or reviewing documents with his legal team. He was shaking hands with a city councilman who just happened to be passing through. My father threw his head back and laughed, a rich, booming sound that echoed off the marble walls. He looked relaxed, powerful, and utterly in control. He was treating the destruction of my life as a networking opportunity. And then there was my mother, Vivian Hawthorne. She sat on a wooden bench nearby, surrounded by two of her friends from the charity board. She was dressed entirely in black. Not a chic business black, but a heavy, mournful black. She wore a veil of netting over her face, just sheer enough to show her red-rimmed eyes. It was a costume. She was dressed for the funeral of her daughter's reputation. "Look at them," I whispered to Daniela. "They are enjoying this." "Of course they are," Daniela replied, checking us in at the security desk. "This is their stage. You are just the prop." As we cleared the metal detector and gathered our bags, Bryce detached himself from his lawyer and walked toward us. He was wearing a suit that probably cost more than my first car. He stopped 5 feet away, knowing exactly where the sight lines were for the reporters still lingering by the glass doors outside. He looked at me with a performance of sad resignation. "Sydney," he said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the onlookers. "It didn't have to end like this. I tried to help you. I really did." I felt the heat rise in my cheeks. The audacity was suffocating. "You forged a contract, Bryce," I said, my voice shaking despite my best efforts. He stepped closer, his eyes cold and dead. "It is finally time for you to pay the price," he said, smiling, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "By noon, you will be nothing." I opened my mouth to retort, to tell him about the routing number, about the notary seal, about the lie he lived every day. Daniela's hand clamped onto my shoulder, hard. "Don't," she hissed in my ear. "He is fishing for a reaction. If you scream at him in the lobby, you look unhinged. If you look unhinged, the judge wonders if you're capable of running a company. Walk away." She was right. I swallowed the bile in my throat and turned my back on him. We walked toward the elevators, leaving Bryce standing there, posing for an audience that didn't know the play was about to change genres. We were halfway down the corridor toward courtroom 7 when my phone buzzed in my pocket. I ignored it. It buzzed again, then a third time, a long, sustained vibration indicating a call. I pulled it out. The caller ID made me stop in my tracks. It was the chief information officer of the regional hospital network. We had secured one of our oldest and most critical clients. "I have to take this," I said to Daniela. "Sydney, we are on in 10 minutes, she warned. "It's the hospital," I said, already sliding the answer button. "Hello, this is Sydney." "Sydney, what in the hell is going on?" The voice on the other end was high-pitched, bordering on panic. "We just got a flag from our firewall. Someone is trying to access the admin panel for the oxygen regulation service." "What?" I gripped the phone tighter. "Who?" "We received an email 10 minutes ago," the CIO shouted. "It is from a trustee, Bryce Hawthorne. It says Northbridge is in liquidation and that under court order, we are required to hand over the root passwords to him immediately for asset verification." He attached a court document. My blood ran cold. "Do not give him anything," I commanded, my voice dropping into the command tone I used during cyber incidents. "That is a phishing attempt. Lock the system. Whitelist only my IP address. Do it now." "I already locked it," the CIO said. "But Sydney, the email is specific. It references the server migration. It says he needs access to verify the Milwaukee transfer before the assets go offline." I froze. The world seemed to slow down. "Say that again," I whispered. "The email says he needs to verify the inventory before it moves to the Milwaukee facility," the CIO repeated. I looked at Daniela. She was watching my face, and she saw the moment the realization hit me. "Send me that email," I said to the CIO. "Forward it to me right now and include the headers." "Sent," he said. I hung up. My phone pinged instantly with a new message. I opened it. There it was in black and white. An email sent from HawthorneCrest.com to a critical infrastructure client. Subject, urgent court-ordered asset seizure. Milwaukee Transfer Protocol. To whom it may concern, as the court-appointed trustee for the estate of Sydney Ross, I require immediate administrative access to verify software assets prior to their relocation to the Milwaukee storage facility. I handed the phone to Daniela. My hand was not shaking anymore. It was steady as a rock. "He fell for it," I said softly. Daniela read the email. Her eyes widened. "He didn't just fall for it. He just committed wire fraud. He is impersonating a federal trustee." He is demanding access to a hospital's life support infrastructure based on a lie we fed him 48 hours ago. The Milwaukee trap, I said. He thinks the servers are moving there today. That is why he is panicking. He wants to seize the code before it leaves the state. This proves everything, Daniela said, her mind racing. It proves he has insider information. Bad information, but insider nonetheless. It proves he is willing to endanger public safety to win a personal vendetta. And it proves he is lying about being a passive investor. Investors don't demand root passwords to oxygen tanks. She looked up at me. We need to print this now. There's a business center down the hall. Wait, I said. I was looking at the timestamp on the email. It was sent 20 minutes ago. He sent this from his phone, I said. He is in the building. He is so arrogant. He thinks he can hack my clients while waiting for the judge to bang the gavel. We ran to the business center. While the printer turned out 5 copies of the incriminating email, the smoking gun that carried the scent of my brother's desperation, I thought about the timeline. I had released the fake Milwaukee memo to my team 2 days ago. Bryce had the information today. That meant the leak was fast, direct. We gathered the fresh papers, hot from the printer, and marched back toward courtroom 7. The bailiff was just opening the doors. The gallery was filling up. My parents were already in the front row, looking somber and dignified. Bryce was at the plaintiff's table, checking his watch, looking annoyed that he hadn't received his passwords yet. I walked to the defendant's table. I did not sit down immediately. I turned around and scanned the room. The gallery was full of reporters, law clerks, and curious onlookers. But in the back row, huddled in a corner near the exit sign, I saw a familiar face. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low, but I recognized the jacket. It was a Northbridge Company jacket. I had given it to him last Christmas. Jason, my project manager, the man who had asked if moving the servers was legal, the man who had walked out to the parking lot to make a call. He was sitting with his arms crossed, staring at the floor. He wasn't here to support me. If he was here for me, he would be sitting behind the defense table. He was sitting where the spectator sat today. He was sitting where he could signal Bryce. Our eyes met across the room. For a second, he looked terrified. He saw me looking at him, and he saw the way I looked at Bryce, and then he saw the stack of freshly printed emails in Daniela's hand. He went pale. He started to stand up, maybe to leave, but the bailiff's voice boomed through the room. All rise. Judge Keene was entering. The doors were closed. Jason sank back into his seat, trapped. I turned back to the front. I looked at Bryce. He was still checking his phone under the table, probably wondering why the hospital hadn't replied. I sat down next to Daniela. She slid the Milwaukee email onto the top of our evidence pile. Ready? She whispered. I looked at my mother's fake tears. I looked at my father's confident posture. I looked at the brother who had just tried to hold a hospital hostage to break me. I have never been more ready in my life, I said. The judge took his seat. The show was about to begin, but they had no idea that I had replaced their script with an indictment. They wanted to shame me in front of the city. I was about to hold up a mirror so clean and so sharp that they would have no choice but to see the monsters they had become. The bailiff called the court to order. He might as well have been announcing the start of a theatrical production. The air in courtroom 7 was thick with the smell of floor wax and the heavier, cloying scent of my mother's perfume. I sat at the defense table, my back straight, my hands resting on the cool surface of the mahogany. Next to me, Daniela Ruiz was a statue of calm, her eyes fixed on the judge, her breathing slow and rhythmic. Across the aisle, the Hawthorne legal team was already in motion. Sterling Vance, my brother's attorney, stood up before his chair had even stopped scraping against the floor. He buttoned his jacket with a flourish that was clearly rehearsed for the cameras outside. Your Honor, Vance began, his voice booming with the practiced resonance of a man who charged $600 an hour. We are here today on a matter of urgent financial necessity. This is not a case we bring lightly. It is a tragedy, a family tragedy. He paused to let the word tragedy hang in the air like a bad smell. My client, Mr. Bryce Hawthorne, is a man of immense patience and generosity, Vance continued, gesturing to where Bryce sat today. My brother had adopted a pose of reluctant sorrow, his head bowed slightly as if he were pained by the burden of having to sue his own sister. He extended a lifeline to the debtor, Ms. Sidney Ross, in the form of a personal loan totaling $2.4 million. He did this to save her company, Northbridge Shield Works, from immediate insolvency. I watched my mother in the front row. Vivian Hawthorne was performing perfectly. She dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, her shoulders shaking with silent, delicate sobs. She looked like the grieving matriarch in a Renaissance painting. Beside her, my father, Graham, shook his head slowly, his face etched with a stoic disappointment that suggested he had tried everything to prevent this, when in reality he had only tried to ensure the press release was typed correctly. Vance paced in front of the bench, his shoes clicking on the hardwood. But instead of using these funds to stabilize her business, the debtor squandered them. Northbridge Shield Works is a shell, Your Honor. It is a chaotic, mismanaged entity that is currently hemorrhaging cash. We have credible information that they are unable to meet payroll, that they are defaulting on vendor contracts, and that the intellectual property, the only asset of value, is at risk of disappearing. He turned and pointed a finger at me. It was a sharp, accusing motion. We are asking the court to appoint a trustee immediately, Vance thundered. We are asking for the keys to the building before Miss Ross destroys what little value remains. We are asking you to protect the creditors from a CEO who is clearly out of her depth. The gallery murmured. I could hear the scratching of pens on notepads. The reporters were eating it up. Tech heiress incompetent. Brother steps in to save day. It was the story they had written before they even walked through the doors. I looked at Daniela. She did not move. She did not object. She simply waited. Judge Mallory Keene sat behind the high bench, his face unreadable. He was a man who had seen everything from corporate fraud to personal bankruptcy, and he had the tired eyes to prove it. He pulled the case file toward him, adjusting his reading glasses. He flipped open the thick binder Vance had submitted. Counsel, the judge said, his voice dry and scratching. You are alleging total insolvency. Yes, Your Honor, Vance said, leaning on the lectern. The company is a sinking ship. Judge Keene nodded slowly. He turned a page, then another. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the sound of paper turning and my mother's theatrical sniffling. I watched the judge's eyes. He was scanning the summary of the petition. He read the claims of debt. He read the request for immediate seizure of assets. Then his hand stopped. He was looking at the cover sheet of the exhibit list, specifically at the full legal name of my company, Northbridge Shield Works. His brow furrowed. He blinked as if trying to clear a smudge from his glasses. He looked up at the ceiling for a brief second, his eyes narrowing in thought, and then looked back down at the paper. It was the look of a man trying to retrieve a specific memory from a crowded filing cabinet in his brain. He turned the page back. He read the paragraph again. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The boredom vanished from the judge's face, replaced by a sharp, piercing alertness. He took off his reading glasses and set them down on the bench with a deliberate click. He did not look at Vance. He did not look at Bryce. He looked directly at me. Ms. Ross, Judge Keene said. His voice was not loud, but it had a weight that silenced the murmuring gallery instantly. It was a tone that demanded absolute truth. I stood up. My legs felt solid. Yes, Your Honor. The judge leaned forward, clasping his hands together. I want you to answer a question for me, and I want you to be very precise. I will, Your Honor. Miss Ross, the judge said, enunciating every syllable. Is Northbridge Shield Works currently a prime contractor for a critical infrastructure project under the jurisdiction of the federal government? The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum. The reporters stopped writing. My mother froze mid-sob. Bryce, who had been inspecting his cuticles, snapped his head up. I looked the judge in the eye. Yes, Your Honor. Specifically, the judge continued, his gaze intensifying. Does your company manage security protocols for the Department of Energy? We do, Your Honor, I replied, my voice ringing clear in the quiet room. We are currently under contract to secure the operational technology for regional power substations. Judge Keene stayed at me for a long moment, confirming what he had read, confirming the memory of the article that had likely been sitting on his breakfast table just that morning. Then he slowly swiveled his chair to face the plaintiff's table. Sterling Vance was smiling, a confused, frozen smile. He looked like a man who had walked onto a tennis court only to realize his opponent was holding a machine gun. "Mr. Vance," the judge said. His voice was dangerously soft. "Are you aware of the entity you are asking this court to seize?" "Your Honor, I believe it is a software startup," Vance stammered, his confidence evaporating. "A small family business." "A family business," the judge repeated. "You have filed a petition to force an involuntary bankruptcy on a defense contractor. You are asking me to hand over the administrative keys and passwords of a national security asset to a private creditor." The judge picked up the file and dropped it back onto the desk. It made a loud, flat thud. "Do you have any idea," the judge asked, his voice rising, "what happens to a federal clearance when a contractor enters bankruptcy proceedings?" Vance opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked at Bryce. Bryce looked furious, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "It freezes," the judge snapped. "The contract is suspended. The security protocols are audited. The grid," he pointed a finger at the ceiling, "is left vulnerable." "Your Honor, we simply want to collect a debt." Vance tried to pivot. "The nature of the business is irrelevant to the debt owed to Mr. Hawthorne. The nature of the business is entirely relevant when you are asking a federal court to interfere with it." Judge Keene barked. He motioned with his hand, a sharp, cutting gesture. "Counsel, both of you, approach the bench now." Daniela stood up smoothly. She did not look at me, but I saw the corner of her mouth twitch upward by millimeter. She walked to the front of the room. Vance practically tripped over his own feet to join her. I sat alone at the table, feeling the eyes of the room on my back. The gallery was buzzing now. The reporters were typing frantically into their phones. The narrative of incompetent heiress had just crashed headfirst into the phrase, national security. I watched the sidebar conference. Judge Keene was not whispering politely. He was leaning over the bench, his face inches from Vance's. I couldn't hear the words, but I could hear the hiss of his voice. He was pointing at the documents. He was pointing at Bryce. Vance was nodding rapidly, his face draining of color until it matched his white shirt collar. His hands were shaking. He tried to say something, pointing back at his client, but the judge cut him off with a look that could have stripped paint from a wall. Bryce was shifting in his seat. He looked around, trying to catch his lawyer's eye, but Vance refused to look back. For the first time, the golden boy looked small. He looked like a child who had broken a vase and was waiting for his father to find the pieces. My father, Graham, had stopped smiling. He was leaning forward, whispering urgently to my mother. He knew. He was a businessman. He knew that approach the bench was bad. But approach the bench while the judge looks like he wants to arrest someone was catastrophic. The conference broke up. Daniela walked back to our table with the stride of a gladiator. Vance stumbled back to his, wiping sweat from his upper lip with a handkerchief that looked far less elegant than my mother's. Judge Keene sat back in his chair. He took a sip of water. He did not look calm. He looked like a volcano deciding whether or not to erupt. "I want this on the record," the judge said, speaking into the microphone. "This court takes its role in the administration of debts very seriously. However, this court also takes a very dim view of being used as a weapon in personal disputes, particularly when those disputes threaten to disrupt the operations of federal agencies." He looked at Bryce. "Mr. Hawthorne," the judge said. Bryce stood up, buttoning his jacket, trying to regain his composure. "Yes, Your Honor. Your counsel has just informed me that you are the sole source of the information regarding the alleged insolvency of this company," the judge said. "You claim that Northbridge is collapsing." "It is, Your Honor," Bryce said, his voice smooth again. "My sister is hiding the truth." "We will see about the truth," the judge said darkly. "Because let me be very clear with you, Mr. Hawthorne. We are no longer just looking at a bankruptcy petition. We are looking at the provenance of these documents. If I find that this court has been misled or that documents have been fabricated to trigger a default on a government contract, the consequences will not be civil. Do you understand me?" "I don't understand, Your Honor," Bryce said, his brow furrowing. "I'm the creditor here." "The consequences," the judge repeated, leaning forward, "will be criminal, perjury, fraud upon the court, and potentially interference with federal operations. The word criminal hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Bryce stopped. His mouth stayed slightly open. The smirk, the arrogant tilt of his head, the look of the aggrieved brother, it all vanished. For the first time in his life, Bryce Hawthorne looked at a person in authority and realized that his last name was not a shield. He sat down slowly. He looked at Vance, but Vance was staring at his shoes. I watched them. I watched the fear take root in their eyes. They had come here to strip me naked in front of the world. They had come to laugh as my company was torn apart. But the judge's question had changed the light in the room. It was no longer a spotlight on my failure. It was an interrogation lamp pointed directly at their fraud. Daniela leaned over to me. He opened the door. She whispered, "Now we walk through it." "Ms. Ruiz," the judge said, turning to my lawyer, "you may proceed with your defense. And I suggest you start by explaining why a solvent defense contractor is sitting in my bankruptcy court." Daniela stood up. She picked up the first of our binders. She picked up the stack of forensic reports. And she picked up the email, the one Bryce had sent to the hospital 20 minutes ago. "Thank you, Your Honor," Daniela said. "We intend to do exactly that. And we intend to show that this petition was not filed to collect a debt. It was filed to facilitate a hostile takeover based on stolen and ultimately false information." She walked to the podium. The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of a predator having realized that the prey was armed. I looked at Jason in the back row. He had pulled his cap down even lower, trying to disappear into the wood of the bench. He knew what was coming. I looked at my mother. She had stopped crying. She was staring at the judge with wide, terrified eyes, her hand clutching her purse so tightly her knuckles were white. She had stamped that document. She had put her name on the line. And now the judge was talking about prison. I took a deep breath. The air in the courtroom didn't smell like perfume anymore. It smelled like ozone. It smelled like the storm had finally broken. And I was the lightning. Daniela Ruiz did not shout. She did not pound the table. She simply walked to the center of the room, positioned the projector screen so the entire gallery could see, and began to dismantle the Hawthorne family myth, piece by agonizing piece. "Your Honor," Daniela said, her voice cool and measured. "The plaintiff's entire case rests on a single document, the so-called Strategic Investment Agreement. They claim this document proves a debt. We claim it proves a crime." She clicked a remote. A blown-up image of the signature page appeared on the screen. On the left was the signature from Bryce's document. On the right were 20 different samples of my actual signature taken from tax returns, driver's licenses, and verified contracts over the last 10 years. If you look at the exhibit on the right, Daniela explained using a laser pointer, you will see that Ms. Ross writes with a heavy downstroke on the capital S and a fluid, unbroken loop on the double S in Ross. It is a rapid, muscle memory motion. She moved the red dot to the forgery on the left. Now look at the plaintiff's document. The ink density is uniform. There are microscopic pauses, hesitation marks where the pen lifted ever so slightly. This was not written. It was drawn. It is a tracing of a signature from a birthday card Miss Ross sent to her brother 5 years ago. We have the original card in our possession, and when overlaid, they are a 100% match. No person signs their name identically twice. Only a photocopier does that. Bryce shifted in his seat, tugging at his collar. His lawyer, Vance, was furiously writing notes, but he looked like a man rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. "But the forgery is lazy," Daniela continued, clicking to the next slide. "Mr. Hawthorne claims to be a sophisticated investor. Yet, the document is riddled with errors that no actual investor would make. Errors that a hoodie-wearing hobbyist, as he likes to call my client, would spot in seconds." The screen changed to the banking details section of the contract. "The routing number listed for the wire transfer is 9 digits, Daniela said. "But the checksum, the mathematical algorithm used by the Federal Reserve to validate banks, fails. This number does not exist. It is a random string of digits typed by someone who has never actually wired money from a commercial account." She turned to the judge. "And even if the number were real, the money was not. We subpoenaed Mr. Hawthorne's personal and business accounts for the month of October 2022, at the exact moment he claims to have wired $2.4 million to save my client. Daniela paused for effect. His primary checking account was overdrawn by $400.50. A ripple of laughter went through the back of the room. It was a nervous, shocked laughter. The golden boy of Lake Forest. The heir apparent was broke. Or at least he was cash poor and pretending to be a tycoon. Bryce's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He looked at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of the reporters, who were now furiously typing this delicious detail into their phones. Northbridge Shield Works, on the other hand, Daniela said, pulling up my company's financials, has been profitable for 3 consecutive years. We have $3 million in cash reserves. We have 0 debt. The claim of insolvency is not just wrong. It is a mathematical impossibility. Judge Keene was not taking notes anymore. He was staring at the plaintiff's table with a look of cold, hard calculation. Mr. Vance, the judge said, do you have a rebuttal for the fact that your client appears to have had negative funds at the time of this alleged massive investment? Vance stood up, looking like he wanted to vomit. Your Honor, funds are often moved through complex trusts. We can provide clarification. Sit down, the judge ordered. Daniela moved to the table and picked up a heavy, sealed plastic bag. She held it up. We have dealt with the signature, she said. Now we must address the seal. She clicked the remote again. The screen showed a high-resolution close-up of the notary stamp pressed into the bottom of the fake contract. The raised letters were clearly visible in the harsh light of the scanner. Vivian E. Hawthorne, Notary Public. A contract of this magnitude requires notarization, Daniela said. This document bears the seal of Mrs. Vivian Hawthorne, the debtor's mother. My mother sat up straighter, clutching her pearls. Her tearful performance had stopped completely. Now she looked like a deer caught in the headlights of a semi-truck. We contacted the Illinois Secretary of State's office, Daniela said. Vivian Hawthorne's commission as a notary public expired on June 30th, 2014. That is 8 years before this document was allegedly signed. The room went dead silent. Using an expired seal is a violation of state law, Daniela said, her voice sharpening. But using a seal to validate a forged signature on a fraudulent loan document? That is conspiracy to commit fraud. My mother couldn't help herself. She shot up from her bench, her face pale. I didn't know, she blurted out, her voice shrill and echoing in the high-ceilinged room. I haven't used that stamp in years. It was in my desk drawer. Someone must have taken it. I don't remember stamping anything. Mrs. Hawthorne, sit down, the bailiff barked, stepping toward her. But the damage was done. The judge looked at her, and his expression was devastating. It wasn't anger. It was pity mixed with disbelief. By claiming she didn't remember and that someone stole it, she had just admitted the stamp was real, that it was hers, and that she had lost control of it to the very people benefiting from the fraud. She had tried to distance herself, but she had only tightened the noose around her son's neck. If she didn't stamp it, then Bryce stole her seal to forge a federal document. If she did stamp it, she was a co-conspirator. There was no third option. My father put a hand on her arm and pulled her down, hissing something into her ear. For the first time, Graham Hawthorne looked old. The networking facade had cracked. Your Honor, Daniela said, seizing the momentum. The plaintiff claims they want to protect the company, but their actions show a reckless disregard for the very asset they claim to value. She picked up the email printout, the one we had rushed from the business center just moments ago. 30 minutes ago, while sitting in this courtroom, Mr. Bryce Hawthorne sent an email to the chief information officer of a regional hospital network. Daniela said. He signed it as Trustee Bryce Hawthorne. She walked the paper to the bench and handed it to the bailiff, who passed it to the judge. He impersonated a court-appointed officer, Daniela continued. He demanded root access passwords to a life support infrastructure system. He attached a fake court order. This is not debt collection, Your Honor. This is a cyber attack launched from the plaintiff's table. Judge Keene read the email. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the paper. Mr. Vance, the judge said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. Did you advise your client to impersonate a federal trustee? No, Your Honor. Absolutely not. Vance shouted, backing away from Bryce as if he were radioactive. I had no knowledge of this. Then your client is acting alone, the judge said, and he is acting dangerously. But here's the final piece of the puzzle, Daniela said. The email Mr. Hawthorne sent references a specific event. He demands to verify the assets before they are transferred to the Milwaukee facility. She turned to me. Miss Ross, is there a facility in Milwaukee? I stood up. No, Your Honor. There is no facility in Milwaukee. We have no operations in Wisconsin. Then why did Mr. Hawthorne reference it? The judge asked, looking confused. Because, Your Honor, I said, my voice steady. 2 days ago, I suspected there was a leak in my company. I suspected my brother was paying someone to feed him information. So, I fabricated a confidential memo. I told my team, and only my team, that we were moving servers to a secret location in Milwaukee. I pointed at the email in the judge's hand. That lie is the only reason the word Milwaukee exists in this case. The fact that it appears in my brother's email proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that he has compromised an employee within Northbridge Shield Works and is using corporate espionage to orchestrate this bankruptcy. The realization hit the room like a physical wave. The reporters gasped. This wasn't just a family feud anymore. It was a spy novel. I didn't look at the judge. I didn't look at Bryce, who was now staring at the table, realizing he had walked into a trap so simple a child could have designed it. I turned around slowly. I looked toward the back row. Jason was sitting there. He looked like he was trying to shrink into a subatomic particle. He had pulled his cap down, but he couldn't hide the shaking of his hands. The information came from inside the house, I said, never taking my eyes off Jason. And the person who sold it is sitting in the back row. Every head in the room turned. The reporters, the clerks, my parents, they all followed my gaze to the man in the Northbridge jacket. Jason looked up. His face was a mask of sheer terror. He met my eyes, and in that second, he knew it was over. He knew. I knew. He knew the judge knew. That man, I said, pointing a finger directly at him. Jason Mayers, my project manager. Daniela stepped forward. We have the trap, Your Honor. We have the bait, and now we have the rat. Judge Keene looked at Jason. Then he looked at Bryce. Then he looked at the email. Bailiff, the judge said, his voice calm and terrifying. Secure the doors. No one leaves this room. Bryce looked up, panic finally breaking through his veneer of arrogance. Your Honor, this is a misunderstanding. I heard about Milwaukee from a source you paid to violate a non-disclosure agreement, the judge snapped. A source you used to commit wire fraud. He picked up the gavel, but he didn't bang it. He held it like a weapon. This hearing is no longer about bankruptcy, Judge Keene announced. We are now conducting an evidentiary hearing regarding fraud, forgery, and the compromise of a federal contractor. My mother let out a low moan and slumped against my father. My father didn't catch her. He was too busy staring at me, his eyes wide with a dawning realization. He had spent his whole life thinking I was the weak link. He had spent years underestimating the girl with the hoodie. But as I stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of their lies, holding the smoking gun of their own greed, he finally saw the truth. He hadn't raised a failure. He had raised a shark, and he had just thrown his son into the water with me. The courtroom was no longer a stage for a family drama. It had become an operating theater, and Judge Keene was holding the scalpel. The air was so tight that breathing felt like an act of defiance. The bailiff stood by the locked double doors, his hand resting casually, but noticeably, on his belt. Judge Keene did not look at the gallery. He did not look at the weeping mother or the trembling mole in the back row. He looked at Sterling Vance. Counsel, the judge said, his voice stripping the varnish off the mahogany tables. I asked you a question 5 minutes ago, and I am still waiting for an answer. You claim Mr. Hawthorne invested $2.4 million. You have shown me a document with a forged signature and an invalid routing number. Now, I want you to show me the money. Vance stood up. He looked like a man trying to hold back a tidal wave with a cocktail napkin. Your Honor, Vance stammered, shuffling papers that I knew were irrelevant. The funds, as I mentioned, the Hawthorne family finances are complex. The liquidity was moved through a series of holding entities to facilitate the speed of the transfer. Name the entity, the judge demanded. I would need to consult with the family accountants, Vance said, wiping sweat from his forehead. You filed a bankruptcy petition based on a specific debt, the judge said, his voice rising. You do not get to consult after the fact. You either have the proof of transfer or you have committed fraud. This was the moment. Daniela Ruiz stepped forward. She did not look at Vance. She looked at my father. Graham Hawthorne was sitting perfectly still, but it was the stillness of a prey animal, hoping the predator's vision was based on movement. His face, usually a mask of tanned confidence, had taken on a sickly, grayish pallor. Your Honor, Daniela said, the plaintiff cannot show you the source of the funds because the funds do not exist in Mr. Bryce Hawthorne's accounts. However, we did find a digital footprint, and it leads somewhere very interesting. She placed a single sheet of paper on the overhead projector. Our forensic accountants analyzed the metadata of the forged loan agreement, Daniela explained. While the routing number is fake, the internal reference code used in the footer, this string of alphanumeric characters right here, is not random. It is a transaction coding format. She pointed to the screen. It is the specific format used by the internal ledger system of Hawthorne Crest Advisors. My father flinched. It was a small movement, a twitch of his left eye, but in the silence of the room, it screamed. Hawthorne Crest Advisors, the judge repeated. That is the father's firm. Yes, Your Honor, Daniela said. And here is where it gets interesting. We did a public record search. Hawthorne Crest Advisors is currently the subject of 3 separate complaints filed with the SEC by high-net-worth clients regarding unauthorized allocation of assets. Essentially, money is missing, and clients are asking where it went. I stayed at Daniela. She hadn't told me this part. The amount referenced in one of those complaints, Daniela said, looking directly at my father, is exactly $2.4 million. The room spun. I looked at my father. I looked at Bryce, and suddenly the pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a force that knocked the wind out of me. This wasn't about jealousy. This wasn't about Bryce being mad that I didn't come to Christmas dinner. This wasn't even about them wanting to steal my government contract to get rich. It was a cover-up. My father had lost money. He had mishandled his clients' funds. He was facing an audit, maybe even prison. He needed a hole to bury the loss in. He needed a scapegoat. Oh my God, I whispered. It was never about me, Daniela continued, her voice relentless. Your Honor, the defense posits a new theory. This was not an attempt to collect a debt. This was an attempt to create a paper trail. They wanted to force Northbridge Shield Works into a chaotic public bankruptcy. They wanted to claim that the missing $2.4 million from Hawthorne Crest had been loaned to the daughter's failing company. They wanted to write it off as a bad family investment. She turned to the gallery, addressing the room. They needed Sidney Ross to be a fraudster so Graham Hawthorne could look like a victim. If I am the reckless daughter who stole the family money and lost it, then my father isn't an embezzler. He is just a grieving parent who trusted the wrong child. The realization hit the room like a physical blow. The reporters were typing so fast their fingers were blurring. This was the twist of the century. The Hawthorne legacy wasn't attacking a rogue daughter. It was trying to cannibalize her to save itself. Judge Keene stared at Graham Hawthorne. The look on the judge's face was terrifying. It was the look of a man who realized he had almost been made an accessory to a massive financial crime. Mr. Hawthorne, the judge said. Graham didn't move. Stand up, the judge ordered. My father stood. He braced his hands on the railing in front of him. His knuckles were white. The networking smile was gone, replaced by the hollow, haunted look of a man watching his life disintegrate. Mr. Hawthorne, the judge said, his voice ice cold. You are an officer of the court in your capacity as a licensed financial fiduciary. You have heard the allegations. Did you knowingly draft or approve the use of this forged document to hide assets from your own firm? Graham licked his lips. He looked at Bryce. Bryce was staring at the table, defeated. There was no help coming from the Hawthorne table today. Your Honor, Graham said, his voice cracking. I had no direct hand in the drafting. My son Bryce handled the specifics with his counsel. Do not play games with me, the judge snapped. The notary seal belongs to your wife. The transaction code belongs to your firm. The beneficiary of this fraud is your balance sheet. Are you telling me your son did this without your knowledge? Graham looked at my mother. Vivian was shaking, her face buried in her hands. She was falling apart. She wasn't built for this. She was built for garden parties and silent auctions, not for federal inquisitions. Graham started, then stopped. He looked at me for a second. I saw a flash of something in his eyes. It wasn't an apology. It was anger. He was angry that I hadn't just taken the fall. He was angry that I had fought back. We just needed time, Graham blurted out. We are going through a transition. We just needed to balance the books for the quarter. So, you decided to destroy your daughter's life to balance your books? The judge asked. She wasn't using the money. Graham shouted, his composure snapping. She was playing with computers. She didn't need that reputation. We just wanted her to stop that project so we could settle the accounts. The room went deadly silent. Graham froze. He realized what he had just said. We just wanted her to stop that project. Daniela pointed a finger at him like a loaded gun. Objection, she shouted, though no question was on the floor. Admission. He just admitted on the record that the goal was to stop the project, to stop a federal infrastructure project. Judge Keene's eyes widened. I heard it, he said. He admitted intent. He admitted that the bankruptcy was a tool to halt my client's operations, Daniela pressed. That is tortious interference. That is conspiracy. Graham slumped back onto the bench. He looked like he had been shot. He had tried to frame it as a financial necessity. But in his panic, he had admitted the tactical goal. Stop Sydney. Stop the contract. Create the chaos. Judge Keene turned to the court reporter. I want that last statement transcribed verbatim. Highlight it. Then he looked at the bailiff. Secure the room. I mean it. If anyone tries to leave, arrest them for contempt. My mother, Vivian, let out a wail. It wasn't a theatrical sob this time. It was a guttural sound of pure terror. Graham, what did you say? Graham? Fix this. Criminal. Quiet, the judge roared. He turned his gaze to the back of the room, to the corner where Jason Mayers was trying to become invisible. And now, the judge said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. We are going to address the mechanics of this conspiracy, because Mr. Hawthorne could not have known when to strike without a map. He pointed at Jason. You in the Northbridge jacket, stand up. Jason didn't move at first. He looked paralyzed. The bailiff took 2 steps toward him, and that was enough. Jason scrambled to his feet. He looked young, terrified, and pathetic. State your name, the judge ordered. Jason Mayers, he whispered. Speak up. Jason Mayers, he yelled, his voice breaking. Mr. Mayers, the judge said, you have been identified by the defendant as an employee of Northbridge Shield Works. Is this true? Yes, Your Honor. Did you communicate with the plaintiff, Bryce Hawthorne, regarding the internal operations of your employer? Jason looked at me. I didn't look away. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing me hurt. I looked at him with the cold indifference of a stranger. Jason looked at Bryce. Bryce was staring at the table, defeated. There was no help coming from the Hawthorne table today. He promised me a job. Jason blurted out. He said Northbridge was going under anyway. He said Sydney was running it into the ground. He told me if I helped them time the filing, if I gave them the dates for the government contract, he would give me a vice president position at Hawthorne Crest. A gasp went through the gallery. A vice president position, the judge repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. You sold out a national security contractor for a job title at a firm that is currently under investigation for embezzlement. The irony hung in the air. Jason had betrayed me to jump onto a sinking ship. He had traded his integrity for a ticket on the Titanic after it had already hit the iceberg. I didn't know. Jason cried. I didn't know about the fraud. I just wanted student loans. He offered me $150,000 a year. You accepted a bribe to facilitate corporate espionage. The judge corrected him. You are not a victim, Mr. Mayers. You are a co-conspirator. The judge turned back to the front of the room. He looked at the wreckage of the Hawthorne family. My mother was weeping into her hands. My father was staring into the middle distance, seeing his career burn to ash. Bryce was shrinking into his suit, a small boy in a man's clothes. And I stood there. I stood there and felt nothing. The anger was gone. The fear was gone. All that was left was a profound sense of clarity. They weren't powerful. They weren't giants. They were just desperate, greedy people who had underestimated the one person they should have feared the most. Judge Keene picked up his gavel. He didn't bang it. He held it, looking at the scene before him. "I have heard enough," the judge said. "In 30 years on the bench, I have seen greed. I have seen malice. But I have rarely seen a family so willing to devour its own child to cover its own crimes." He looked at me. "Miss Ross," he said softly, "I apologize that your court system was used as a stage for this farce." Then his face hardened into stone. "But the show is over. Now comes the judgment." The silence that descended upon Courtroom 7 was not the silence of peace. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a vacuum just before the air rushes back in to cause an explosion. Judge Mallory Keene did not reach for his gavel immediately. He sat with his hands clasped over the mountain of evidence that Daniela had stacked on his bench. The forged contract, the forensic analysis of the fake routing number, the expired notary seal, and the email that proved my brother had tried to hold a hospital hostage. He looked at the Hawthorne table. My father, Graham, was slumped over, his face gray. My mother, Vivian, was staring at her hands as if they belonged to a stranger. Bryce was vibrating with a mix of terror and impotent rage, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. When the judge finally spoke, his voice was low, devoid of the earlier sarcasm. It was the voice of the federal government, cold and absolute. "I have sat on this bench for 22 years, Judge Keene said. I have presided over bankruptcies caused by market crashes, by poor management, and by bad luck. But I have never, in 2 decades, presided over a case where the bankruptcy system was weaponized as an instrument of personal destruction." He picked up the petition, the document Bryce had filed to destroy me. "The court finds that this petition was filed in bad faith," the judge declared. "But calling it bad faith is a kindness this plaintiff does not deserve. This filing is a fabrication. It is a fraud. It is a calculated attempt to disrupt the operations of a solvent company, Northbridge Shield Works, which is currently engaged in the protection of critical national infrastructure." He looked directly at Bryce. "You did not come here seeking relief, Mr. Hawthorne. You came here seeking sabotage. You forged documents. You utilized an expired notary seal belonging to your mother. You bribed an employee to violate his non-disclosure agreement. And most egregiously, you impersonated a federal trustee to attempt to breach the security of a hospital network." Bryce opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Accordingly, the judge continued, his voice rising. "I am dismissing this involuntary bankruptcy petition, effective immediately." Sterling Vance, Bryce's lawyer, let out a small sigh of relief, likely thinking the nightmare was over. He was wrong, and, the judge added, sharpening his tone, "I am dismissing it with prejudice. That means, Mr. Hawthorne, that you are permanently barred from filing any claim against Miss Ross on Northbridge Shield Works regarding this alleged debt ever again. You cannot refile. You cannot sue in state court. This debt is judicially determined to be a fiction." The judge then turned to the bailiff. "Furthermore, this court is retaining custody of all exhibits presented today. Exhibit A, the forged loan agreement. Exhibit B, the notary seal evidence. And Exhibit C, the email correspondence sent by the plaintiff this morning." My father's head snapped up. He knew what was coming. "I am directing the clerk of court to forward a full transcript of these proceedings, along with all physical evidence, to the United States Attorney's Office for the Northern District of Illinois," Judge Keene announced. "I am formally referring this matter for criminal investigation regarding bankruptcy fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to interfere with federal operations." My mother let out a sound that was half gasp, half scream. She clutched my father's arm, her fingernails digging into his expensive suit. "Criminal," she whispered, her voice carrying in the silent room. "Graham," she said. "Criminal. Does that mean prison?" Graham did not answer her. He couldn't. He was watching his own life flash before his eyes. The investigation wouldn't stop with Bryce. It would follow the money. It would lead back to the missing $2.4 million at Hawthorne Crest Advisors. It would lead to the audit he was so desperate to avoid. Sterling Vance stood up, his professional survival instinct kicking in. Your Honor, if I may, regarding the referral, my client was acting under extreme emotional duress. Sit down, Mr. Vance. The judge cut him off. You brought a theater stage into my courtroom and expected me to call it the law. You are lucky I'm not sanctioning you personally for bringing this case without due diligence. Vance sat down so hard his chair skidded backward. But Bryce could not take it. The pressure that had been building inside him, the realization that he had lost, that he was broke, that he was going to be investigated, and worst of all, that I had won, finally caused him to snap. He jumped to his feet, slamming his hands on the table. It's not Faye. Bryce shouted, his face twisted into a mask of ugly, spoiled entitlement. She's the one who ruined everything. It's my money. It's my family's money. She was supposed to fail. Mr. Hawthorne. Silence. The bailiff stepped forward, hand on his taser. I just wanted her dragged down. Bryce screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me. She thinks she's so special with her little company. I just wanted to break her. The confession rang through the courtroom, echoing off the high ceiling. I wanted to break her. It was the final nail. He had admitted it. It wasn't about the money. It wasn't about the debt. It was about pure, unadulterated malice. Judge Keene looked at Bryce with an expression of utter disgust. Let the record reflect, the judge said quietly, that the plaintiff has openly admitted his motivation was malicious intent to harm the defendant. Marshal, please escort Mr. Hawthorne and his counsel out of my courtroom and ensure Mr. Mayers in the back row is detained for questioning by the federal agents, who I assume are already on their way. Jason, the mole, put his head in his hands and began to sob. I watched as the marshals moved in. Bryce looked at me one last time as they guided him toward the side exit. The arrogance was gone. The hate was gone. There was only Faye. He looked like a child who had set a fire and suddenly realized he was trapped in the burning house. My mother collapsed onto the bench, weeping uncontrollably. My father stood there, staring at the empty space where his son had been. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. The Hawthorne dynasty, built on appearances and handshakes, had crumbled in less than 2 hours. The judge turned to me. His face softened slightly. Miss Ross, he said, you are free to go, and on behalf of the court, I wish you luck with your government contract. It seems the country is in capable hands. I did not cheer. I did not smile. I did not pump my fist in the air. I simply stood up. I straightened my blazer. I turned to Daniela Ruiz, whose eyes were shining with the thrill of the kill. Thank you, Daniela, I said softly. We did it, she whispered. We really did it. I began to gather my files. I packed the binders. I packed the forensic reports. I moved with the slow, deliberate calm of a person who has walked through a hurricane and learned how to breathe in the thunder. I was not the same woman who had walked in here terrified this morning. I was forged in this fire. We turned to leave. The gallery parted for us. The reporters, usually loud and aggressive, were silent as I walked past. They knew they had just witnessed something rare, not a scandal, but a reckoning. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the marble hallway. The air out here felt different, lighter. Sydney. The voice was ragged. I stopped. I didn't turn around immediately. I knew that voice. It was the voice that had told me I would fail. It was the voice that had dismissed my dreams as a hobby. I turned slowly. Graham Hawthorne was standing by the courtroom doors. My mother was behind him, dabbing her eyes, looking at me with a mixture of fear and desperation. My father took a step toward me. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The suit didn't fit him right anymore. Sydney, he said, his voice trembling. Please, we need to talk. We can fix this. We can call the lawyers off. We are family. You can't let them take Bryce. You can't let them look into the fam. He reached a hand out. Daughter, please. I looked at his hand. It was the same hand that had signed the checks for Bryce's cars while I was eating instant noodles. It was the same hand that had patted me on the head and told me to go work in compliance. I looked him in the eye. "I am not your daughter today, Graham," I said. "I'm the CEO of Northbridge Shield Works." "Sydney, don't do this," my mother wailed. "We are your parents." "If you were my parents," I said, my voice steady and cold as steel, "you would have been proud of me. You wouldn't have hired a stranger to destroy me." I took a step back, putting distance between us. "And just so we are clear," I said, delivering the final truth that had been burning in my chest for 8 years, families argue at dinner. Families fight over holidays. But families do not hire lawyers to bankrupt each other in front of the entire city. I turned away. "Sydney," he called out again, his voice breaking. I didn't stop. I didn't slow down. I walked toward the revolving doors where the gray light of Chicago awaited. Behind me, the cameras were flashing, capturing the image of the Hawthorne parents standing alone in the wake of the child they had thrown away. I walked out into the cool air. The wind hit my face, and for the first time in my life, it didn't feel cold. It felt fresh. It felt like the future. I had walked into that building as a defendant. I was walking out as a victor. And as I hailed a cab to go back to my office, back to my team, back to the work that mattered, I knew one thing for sure. I would never have to sit at that table again. I had built my own. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever been through something like this with your own family? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to know.